Here we have a chart made up of two groups of axes. The first axis contains a measure values field that represents two measures in a bar chart. The second is a dual axis made up of these two fields. By default, the range of each axis will remain independent unless or until we enable Synchronize Axes. But what if we wanted to have all these fields appear on the same axis, similar to how the dual axis feature works, but with more than just two fields? Well, as of right now, Tableau doesn't allow us to incorporate more than two fields into a dual axis, hence the name. So we're going to create a workaround using floating objects, by overlaying one chart on top of another to give the appearance that they're sharing the same axis. The trick here, though, is ensuring that both axes have the same range, even when they're not used inside the same worksheet. So to get started, let's remove one of the fields from our current setup and create a dual axis using measure values in one other field. Just remember to synchronize the axes to make sure they're properly aligned. Then we're going to create a new view and add the field we removed from the previous one. As we're looking for order count, we can go the long route of first dragging order ID onto rows, then right-clicking to locate the appropriate aggregation, or we could simply right-click when dragging the field onto rows, which will immediately provide us with a list of aggregations to choose from. Now we can compose our chart with the same elements that made up the first one, and apply the same view settings. Note that the color of the line is not as we had it before. So to fix this, we will add measure names to color to bring back the previous color selection we already assigned to that measure. Of course, you can set the color without the use of the measure names field, but this approach will come in handy later when it comes to displaying and consolidating the different legends. So the issue now is that we need to make this axis align with the axis on the first view. To do that, we're going to create a calculated field and use the max function. This function provides the highest value between two arguments. So if we compare these two fields and use this calculation in a view, it would return whichever of these two arguments holds the higher value. However, we need to compare all four measures in this case. But if we try to add any more measures to the argument, an error message will appear because we've exceeded the capacity of arguments allowed. So to counter this, we're simply going to nest two max functions inside another one. So the next one we create will compare the remaining two measures, and the final function will contain both of the other two max functions we've already created. This way, we can still use the max function to find the highest value across all four measures. So let's apply this to our axis by dragging the calculation onto details and right-clicking on the axis to add a reference line. Set the scope to entire table and select our newly calculated field for the value. Set the aggregation to maximum and ensure all other fields are disabled, as for all intents and purposes, we want the reference line to be invisible. However, as we know it's there, by hovering near the top of the chart, we can find the secret reference line, which shows us that the maximum of the four fields we've compared lies here on the axis. By returning to the first chart, we can confirm that this is true. Now we'll repeat the process of adding a reference line here, as there may be a situation in future where the highest value sits on the second chart and not the first. It doesn't matter which field or axis you choose to add the reference line to, as all the axes are synchronized and therefore all of them will be affected. As the plan is to make it seem as though both charts are one and the same by laying them on top of each other, let's hide the second axis from showing here, as the second chart only has one. Let's also make sure there is no background color on the second chart, so that when we place it over the first, we can actually see the first chart underneath. Finally, we can begin creating the dashboard. Let's bring in the first view, followed by the second, which we can then switch to a floating object. Alternatively, we can shift-click to drag it into the view as a floating object straight away. To make our lives a bit easier, let's make sure the chart is positioned where we want it and make a note of the accompanying positioning and padding settings. This will help give us a basis for aligning our second chart on top of it. You could also remove one of the titles and add a blank space. We can see that our alignment is still slightly off, and this likely has to do with the different widths of the axes. So hover over the top chart to find where the axis ends and drag it out to align with the axis below it. This has helped to improve alignment, but it still isn't perfect. So we can play around with the X and Y positions, as well as the height and width a little bit more, but we may simply need to go to the first chart underneath and format the axis to appear invisible. This will prevent any minor misalignment issues from appearing, as the only labels we see will be those from the top graph. Finally, with the top chart still selected, go to Analysis, Legends, and show the remaining color legend. the legend will likely appear as a floating object to match the floating chart. So we can correct this by shift dragging it until it snaps into a non-floating container. Then hide the title and adjust the padding of both legends so they both appear to be part of the same legend.